I'm here today to talk about the dead in early modern English magic. The early modern period is generally considered to be about 1500 to about 1700. Depends which historians you talk to, but that's the usual period. Think more Blackadder 2 than Blackadder 3. So I'm going to talk about three things. This is sort of the structure of the thing. We're going to talk about what it's like to die in early modern England, the main causes of death, the main sort of death customs. Then we're going to start into the meat of it, if you will, the corpses and components section. And then finally we'll look at ghosts and necromancers and images of necromancers in this period. Without further ado, the first thing to bear in mind about this period is that life expectations are incredibly short. Life expectation at birth was between 25 and 35 years in the early modern period. Infant mortality rates were very high, marriages often ended by death, and very few adults reached much of what we moderns would consider old age. As a way of imagining this, Alan McFarlane says most of a person's closest relatives have died by the time he or she had reached the age of 20. It's perhaps not surprising then that the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes remarked famously that the natural state of humanity at a time of war, and this is crucial, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The war is important in that quote to bear in mind. The history of 17th century England, the end of the early modern period, is marked by the English civil wars, which are the bloodiest conflicts that these islands have ever seen. And yes, that's right, wars, plural. They're generally regarded to be at least 2 and maybe 3, again, depending on who you ask. An awful lot of history comes down to interpretation of who's shouting the loudest very often, and who's popular at conferences. So I'm going to very, very briefly take you through these, because they are quite important for understanding the context of death and dying. I do also understand that wars and kings are often the kinds of things that put people off history at school, and so I promise it'll be really brief. I'll try and make it as brief as possible. So the First Civil War starts technically in 1642 with Edge Hill, and it ends, in theory, with Naseby. You've got the conflict of the parliamentarians and the royalists. That's all you really need to know at this point. The second one, it ends, the first one ends, and there's a kind of power vacuum because the king's been gotten rid of, but he's still around, and the second one starts again, and for a start, the army want paying. The new model army has been created, and it's brilliant, but it's now lying idle after the First Civil War, and they want paying, so a bunch of uprisings begin, and the king takes advantage of these, and another round of Parliament versus royalists starts up. And this one's far bloodier. A lot of people, a lot of the royalists, when they were defeated in the first one, were sworn, this is the kind of honour-bound society, were sworn not to raise arms again. And those that did and were captured were treated mercilessly. There were also far more civilian casualties and war crimes now occurring. And as a sort of mark of the bloody nature of the second one, it ends with the execution of Charles I on the 30th of January 1649. The third one is kind of an inverted commas because it's sometimes argued to be more of an Anglo-Scottish war. Basically, Charles I's son, Charles II, surprisingly, is in Scotland after he's fled. The execution of a king, which is remarkable at this point, stirs an awful lot of separate warring Scottish factions to unite against the English independence, and they invade. It doesn't go very well. It ends with arguably ends with the Battle of Worcester, where Charles II runs away, hides in an oak tree, which we get the royal oak from, and then runs away further to France to stay with his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria. That is for 9 years until he returns for the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. The important thing to bear in mind about all that kind of stuff is that a lot of people died. That's really what I'm trying to get at. These figures are rough, and they don't necessarily just reflect how many people died on the battlefield as a result of being bayoneted or shot. They also include disease, starvation, and various other factors. In England, we get the rough figure of 190,000. This is a population at the time, in the 17th century, of about 5 million. In Scotland, the figure is 60,000 of about 1 million. And in Ireland, we really don't have time to go over the Irish Confederate Wars of 1641 to 1653. But over the course of 12 years, 616,000 people of the population of 1.5 million are killed, and 2/3 of these are civilians. I go over the civil wars for you here, not for some abstract argument about flintlock musket technology or even revolution in the face of absolutism, but the fact that an awful lot of people died, and on this day of all days, it's important to remember those kinds of things. So war wasn't the only big killer throughout the early modern period. We also have an awful lot of plague that turns up. These are some of the figures for London. Some of the spikes include the outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1603, so we get roughly 30,000 deaths in London. In 1625, we have 41,000. In 1636, we have 10,000. Moving away from such a metropolar analysis, Dr. Thomas Gumbel, who's the chaplain to the Duke of Albemarle, who stayed in London for the course of the epidemic, estimated the total death count of the entire country for the plague during 1665 to 66 was about 200,000. To complete our litany of the Four Horsemen, famine is also rife during this period, all across Europe, 1590s and the 1620s, and also in Scotland in the 1690s. That famine wipes out about 50% of the population in a very short amount of time. And these are mainly rural areas that are affected by famine. In short, while city life risked the fleas jumping from rotting bodies and sheer overcrowding that turns disease into epidemic, country living gave you the bracing simplicity of mass starvation. There are also, worth pointing out, some very unusual causes of death in this period, moving away from the big en masse end of the spectrum to the more select ones. This is probably quite hard to read. There are a number of strange causes of death, or we might consider them strange in this period. The chief one, or the first one I want to talk about, is medical and psychological models at the time held that extreme states of emotion could actually be fatal. One could literally die of fright, a broken heart, or grief. We have here in deaths for London for 1632, 11 people listed as dying of grief. The other one to bear in mind is astrology, which is not merely something people are reading their stars in the paper or the almanac, although they were doing that. It's been argued that most English people learned to read over this period with the mass increase of publications of almanacs, which were a mixture of kind of magazines, calendars, and astrological lore. And in this case, we have 13 people listed as being killed by planet. That's a mixture of planet struck, so the notion of if someone spontaneously drops dead and you don't know why, you can blame planet or the stars. But it's also a very specific kind of death resulting from the conjunctions of planets, chiefly of Saturn and Jupiter, quite a few of which occurred during this period. There's an early astrologer and kind of proto-sociologist, John Goad, who was one of the first people to notice that suicide rates varied across the year and started to connect them to astrological conjunctions. We'll return to suicide later. Enough maybe about figures at this point. I want to talk briefly about some of the customs that would have occurred if you or someone you knew died in this period. One of the first ones to bear in mind, and it has a bearing on ghosts as well, is that people weren't necessarily buried in coffins. That's a good start. Frequently, most people who wouldn't be able to afford a coffin would have been put in a shroud, which was linen, usually, like Jesus, until a particular act of 1666 designed to support an alien textile industry changed that to wool and made everyone use woolen shrouds instead. The reason these images are up is that they represent an incredibly popular image of the pale ghost in the white sheets with it whipping at their feet. Owen Davies points out that this is more a stereotype exploited by hoaxers and used in literary and pictorial representations over the centuries. This is the ghost in a winding sheet tied up at the top of the head but loose at the bottom with tapir in hand, which is especially popular in the 17th century. Other funeral practices include things like bells, which would have been either rung by the church, a particular number of peals indicating whether it was a man, woman, or child who died. Also, people fronting at the back of, and/or at the back of funeral processions would ring bells as well. John Donne points out that these are often said to drive away evil spirits. Then we've got the use of salt, which could be used to protect the corpse. And this protection is interesting, because it's not merely warding off evil spirits, it's also protecting the corpse from becoming the restless dead, from becoming something dangerous, something that could blight crops, that could cause disease, that could do damage. So protection works both ways. One slightly odder funeral practices was that of sin eating. I'm going to go into too much depth here either, but effectively, if you were worried that you were entering the afterlife, with some debt, or having, been a bit of a bad person, you could pay off someone, usually someone poor who needed the money and food, to take your sins on for you, a sort of karmic transference. And you would give them bread and beer, usually in a maple bowl, and a token amount of money, usually sixpence, which would be given to the poor over the corpse, which would be brought out, and in this act of consuming, you would also be taking on their sins. This wasn't the only means of alms, which it technically was a form of. Other times, people would simply dole out food for the poor in order to, lift their karmic score sheet up as they were shuffling off. Money was also used for grave goods as well. John Aubrey, who also reports in the sin eating, reports in the 17th century that there's a Welsh and English practice of placing a coin in the mouth of the dead to give to St. Peter. And he says that this is an earlier Catholic practice. Either way, it was usual in England for the corpse to be buried with feet towards the east, as well as face up, so to meet the angel of resurrection. A funeral wasn't also the only time that you would commemorate your dead. Wouldn't be necessarily the last time you'd honour them. In post-Reformation England and Wales, commemorations, as they were called, occurred at the end of the month, and a year, and at All Souls. These were not necessarily fully approved of by the authorities. There's an injunction for the Diocese of Durham, I found, from 1577, that tries to ban them. But as several historians point out, the practice still continues. It's very hard to stop people remembering their dead, however they want to do that. Another one, the little traditions of soul cakes, or heart cakes, as sometimes known in North. And the idea was each one of these that you would eat would be a soul guaranteed for escaping purgatory. Purgatory is another very important concept, especially as relates to ghosts and the tensions that exist in the early modern period in England, certainly between Catholicism and Protestantism. Greenery is used in an awful lot of funerals, especially in the form of wreaths, but also boughs that would have been laid either on the grave or on the corpse itself, as it was put up in its winding sheet. Most common was rosemary. Rosemary has been used for a very, very long time, from at least the Egyptians in funerary practices, and has a long tradition of aiding the memory. The Greeks would wind it into their hair when they were about to do exams. But as a result of this idea of improving memory, it was also the idea of strengthening the remembrance of the dead. It's also got a bunch of connotations with cleansing as well. It was used and strewn in churches all through the medieval period and into the early modern. So it has this property of both cleansing, purifying, and strengthening remembrance. Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, remarks in that book that it's the chosen emblem of our funeral wakes and in our burial grounds, because it is a herb sacred to remembrance and therefore to friendship. I guess the conclusions I just want to draw from that sort of very brief thing is that death was this constant presence in early modern England, whether from war or famine, the plague, or other diseases along with the bubonic plague, or even from our own passions or from the stars. Death stalks the land at this time. There were, to put it bluntly, a lot of dead people about. And it's armed with such familiarity with these contexts that we can approach early modern occult philosophy and magical practices involving the dead. So, what have the dead imagined then? Well, to begin with the broadest definition of the dead, we might start by considering, I will start by considering the use of dead animals in both sacrificial ritual and the spell components. I'm not being a Marnie vegetarian here by saying animals are people too. I'm saying that by looking at how we used animals, an awful lot of the same principles of occult philosophy are present when we look at the use of dead humans. I want to begin with a kind of slightly lurid example, perhaps most eager to spring to mind when you mention necromantic use of animals. So let's talk about the spirit of Zagan. The tried and true experimentum for love in the Liber de Angelis Annulus Caritabus and Imaginarius Planetarum, which is a 15th century text, which Juris G. Lydekker describes as a herbal and medical miscellany with some relationship to the Sloane group of grimoires and manuscripts, has an experiment, a spell that runs as follows, where you take 3 doves and a cedar stack, make a circle, and at the 9th hour go to a crossroads or a place where thieves are hung, and take with you 3 doves and a small white knife having a hilt. Do not speak to anyone, neither going nor returning, and thus when you have come to the crossroad or to the other place, blacken the circle and sacrifice the first dove, tearing apart its flesh and casting it through the air. Invoke Zagan, who rules over this experiment, saying, "O Zagan, take this dove which I sacrifice to you." You do this 2 more times, going at particular times of the evening, not talking to anyone while you're doing it, and when you return the final time to kill the final dove, there should be a character of some sort, whether that's branches on the ground or a stone, which you take and then you have to show to someone, and they'll instantly fall in love with you. The place of the operation, a crossroads or place where thieves are hung, is, of course, a liminal space, a thing that's not quite there, an intermediary, a boundary crossed. It's literally suspended between life and death. And the deaths of the doves are made explicitly as a sacrifice. Now, although this magical operation comes from a 15th century text, which is a little bit earlier than strictly what the early modern period is called, the spirit Zagan, or Zogan, or Zagan, which owing to typical transcription typos, not to mention the fact that the standardization of spelling doesn't start creeping in until the 1700s to the 18th century. This spirit appears as a demon in the Pseudo-Monarchia Deminorum and the Ars Goetia of the Lemegeton, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, 2 incredibly popular books of demonology throughout the 17th century. We find Zagan's seal in the grimoire, at least, of Dr. Thomas Rudd, dated to roughly around 1655. The doves' deaths themselves are not merely the only magical factor in this working. The blood of these deaths, let by tearing apart its flesh and casting them through the air, is also of primary importance. It leads on to considering the use of animal components as depositories of occult virtue. To kind of explain this concept briefly, I'm going to cherry-pick some quotes from Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who compiles arguably the most important magical text of the early modern period, his 3 books on occult philosophy. And he explains this transference of the potencies of animals to humans using parts of the animals. It says, if therefore we would obtain any property or virtue, let us seek for such animals in which such a property is more eminent manner than in any other thing. As if at any time we would procure love, let us seek some animal which is most loving, by which kind are pigeons, turtle doves, sparrows, swallows, wagtails. And in these let us take those members or parts in which the venereal appetite is most vigorous, such as the heart, testicles, matrix, womb, yard, penis, sperms, and menstrues. And it must be done at a time when these animals are at their most loving. So, carrying the heart of a nocturnal animal such as a bat will deny you sleep, just as the animals that are long-lived conduce to long life. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these kind of principles. The association of doves with love is very long, so much so that they are Agrippa's go-to definition of the whole technique itself. Doves are naturally a Venusian animal, but moreover the Book of Secrets of Albertus Magnus tells us that the dove, along with the sparrow and the swallow, is of this kind, especially when they are delighted in love or carnal appetite, for then they provoke and bring love without resistance. This kind of magical tech comes to Agrippa via Albertus, who receives much of it from the Chiranides, the 4th century Greek collection of Hermetic magical works. These are old customs being used in early modern England. Animal components were particularly suited to works of provoking passion. And to understand this, we need to just briefly look at conceptions of the early modern soul. It goes a bit like this. So plants like the rosemary have a nutritive faculty of their soul. This is known as nourishment and growth. Animals have a nutritive faculty and a sensitive faculty. This is the animal soul level. It governs perception, desire, and passions or emotions. Humans have a rational faculty as well, what makes us special. We have all of these as well, obviously, because we grow and feel. But we also have the ability to reflect on our own passions and to rein them in. And the notion in the early modern period was that because animals don't have a rational soul, but they do have a sensitive, rational faculties of their soul, but they do have the sensitive parts, that they would feel their passions when they expressed them would be unadulterated. And so, if you want to see what melancholy looks like, kick a cat. This is the kind of thing that they suggest in their psychological handbooks of how to understand emotion in ourselves and in others. And so, the notion was that these occult virtues were best expressed through animals, and so you could gather the sense of the unadulterated love that a dove kept within its heart and its liver, and use those for various different purposes. So what of the blood of doves then? Well, blood's also important because it's one of the four humours which underlie the basis of Western medicine and psychology and psychiatry for approximately 1.5 millennia. Part of the body of knowledge that gets called Galenism, Galen. And the notion is that you have four humours which correspond to the four elements that make up the cosmos. The classical four elements that Euclid lays out. And the blood is the sanguine humour, it's the hot and moist humour that corresponds to air and to spirit more broadly. Blood was actually used to mean two things. It was the literal humour, which we might think about like plasma, as a modern parallel, and blood as the thing that carried all the other humours around as well. So we already have this sense of it being a good mixer, and that's really what the sanguine humour was about. Sanguine people as a personality type were meant to be very good, very sociable, very affable, very jovial. It was ruled by Jupiter. They're also very lascivious, and the notion of good mixing going into the realm of not only obsequious or oily, which also have the dual meanings that are maintained with us of being literally tactile, but also a bit creepy. And this is kind of where blood again gets associated with lust, love, and love magic. So to use the blood of a dove was to use one of the most apt parts of the Venusian animal, all carefully selected for the very purpose of a love spell. So what about people then? In speaking of magics for works of wrath, for war, for hexing, for anger, for hatred, Agrippa tells us that such magical material can be made from the gall of a man as effectively as with the blood of a lapwing or a bat or of a goat. The gall was considered the organ that was the depository of yellow bile or choler, which is the fiery humour, and thus powerful for strengthening this kind of choleric magic. Historian F. David Herniger points out that frequently gall in Shakespeare, for example, implied the bitterness of a passion. He quotes Tybalt getting annoyed about how he's not allowed to kill Romeo or Parted, and speaks of his gall being inflamed. Again, these corpse components are sources of functionally useful properties and are depositories of appropriate occult virtue to deploy. It would, of course, make sense to take the gall from a particularly angry or vengeful person, or the corpse, as personality could be located in and strengthened by this kind of humoral habituation. Your particular humours would govern your proclivities, your kind of predispositions towards particular kinds of behaviour. But if you kept doing them, they would habituate, become more common. The angry man not only lives in an angry world, but makes his world angry. Equally, the events of your life could empower your corpse to be useful. Agrippa, again referencing Albertus Magnus, claims the bone of a dead man, which never had a fever, being laid upon the patient, frees him of his corruption. Particular feverish affliction. So the virtues of corpses themselves could also leak into houses and objects. There was a contagion of the virtues of the corpse itself. It's remarked that a man passing by a place where a man was slain on a carcass newly hit is moved with fear and dread, because the air in that place, being full of the dreadful species of manslaughter, doth, being breathed in, move and trouble the spirit of the man with the like species, whence it is that he comes to be afraid. And this could even extend to grave dirt itself. Agrippa gives a spell for women involving both the earth in which a corpse was buried and a cloth which was used in a funeral, so that no man will be able to lie with her as long as she have it about her. This is an interesting inversion of the fertility and death thing, which is also present in this period. So it's not so much about being haunted by a ghost itself at this point, but by the weight of death, if you like, the very virtue of the corpse itself, the very properties, propensities, and abilities to affect things that the corpse emanates, as everything emanates these kinds of virtues in this view of magical universe. So what about dead man's blood? Well, I mean, Agrippa recounts that Apuleius tells of the sorceress Pamphila procuring love using the blood of them that were hanged. But I want to talk about a slightly more popular, although evidentially shaky account, which has a magical potency attributed to a dead person's blood. At the culmination of King Charles I's execution in 1649, supposedly the crowd rushes forward and dips their handkerchiefs in the dead king's blood. This is, at least according to Philip Henry, who's an English nonconformist and royalist propagandist, writing 12 years after the fact during the Restoration. This myth, or account, might itself be a clever inversion of the charges that were levelled against the king when he was executed. Now, he was executed for treason, which is required, whether you call it an upending of British constitutional law or a coup. Depends which side of the offence you fall on the evidence. But certainly the king was called the man of blood, and this references both the second book of Samuel and also Numbers 35, 33, in which is said that the only way to the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. And this notion of after 2 or 3 very bloody civil wars, someone is a scapegoat is needed, and that scapegoat becomes Charles I. So this idea of his blood being magical is a way of inverting the very reasoning that's given the biblical basis for his execution. And this itself is also based on the older notion that a king's touch could cure certain diseases, chiefly the king's evil, scrofula, which is a kind of tuberculosis. So whether or not the dipping of cloth in martyr's blood to create relics actually occurred, the report of it certainly also played up older notions of the magic of blood and relics in kings and of those appointed by God. And it's that segue that I want to talk briefly about miracles attributed to saints, which also extended well beyond their own lifetimes, of course. Historian Stephen Wilson remarks that this power that emanated from the dead, and therefore there remains anything in contact with them, had power by association, say contagion. And therefore this was one of the bases of the Christian cult of the saints that existed at the time. Such practices, especially the notion of praying directly to the saints, for them to directly intercede rather than asking them to pray for you, were viewed very suspiciously by many Protestant theologians. These men felt that such saint work was entirely too close to high Catholic ritual, in which many in England was becoming ever more confused piety with idolatry. The Bishop of Lincoln, Thomas Barlow, went as far as saying this was pagan superstition, but Barlow was also one of the last English bishops to believe and actively campaign against the Pope as the literal Antichrist. One Catherine Lowe, having a husband not so readily disposed that way as she wished him to be, made a waxen image of the likeness of her husband's bewitched member, and offered it up at St. Anthony's altar, so as, through the holiness of the Mass, it might be sanctified to be more courageous and of better disposition and ability, etc. Not only is Lowe's husband's impotence, which presumably it is, treated as a matter of bewitchment, which is interesting in itself, it is also considered an explicitly passional language. It requires the heat of noble, choleric courage to combat this imposed frigidity. More to the point, the ritual is not only counter-magical, but for a beneficial healing aim, actually drawing on established Christian practices and customs, the intercessional and thaumaturgical, literally miracle-working powers of St. Anthony, as well as the cleansing, sanctifying, and transformative effects of the Mass. So, what about ghosts? What about the dead returned, or risen, and walking? Early modern ghosts appeared for a multitude of reasons, most often glimpsed briefly, although sometimes to impart information. Chiefly these apparitions could often appear to impart messages of warning to the living. John Aubrey gives an account of a friend of his who was visited by the ghost of a friend who told him that the inquisitors were after him, and so he fled and was saved from them. There's also a really interesting account of a ghost returning to finish unsettled, unfinished business, especially that of when them or theirs have been wronged, a lot of the time children. This account says that one married a second wife, and contrary to the agreement and settlement at the first wife's marriage, did wrong the children by the first venter. The settlement, the agreement of what was what the kids were meant to get, was hid behind a wainscot in the chamber where the doctor's sister did lie, and the apparition of the first wife did discover it to her, by which means right was done to the first wife's children. There's also one other relatively famous account of a ghost returning to right wrongs and impart information, and it's the ghost of a famous man, in fact. The magician and self, indeed publicly identifying Rosicrucian John Hayden, recounted the following tale of the ghost of herbalist Nicholas Culpeper, who famously translated the Pharmacopoeia from Latin into vulgar English. He says that Culpeper, whose ghost appeared to his widow, Alice Culpeper, and spake to her in the lively image of his deceased body, bidding her vindicate him, who was abused by some booksellers. He would have known this as well. Hayden ended up marrying the widow Culpeper. Furthermore, the spectral Culpeper even submitted new works from beyond to the grave. He appeared to a fellow in his house, Dr. Thomas Harrington, and gave him a paper which is now published, bearing the title Mr. Culpeper's Ghost Giving Seasonable Advice to the Lovers of His Writings, and sold by Peter Cole. These apparitions are really the souls of the deceased and no devils, as some fondly conceive, and as you may read of in this book. So Culpeper is publishing from beyond the grave, talk about prolific. We have to ask, is this marketing strategy? Is this a literary conceit? Is it the product of some necromantic working? Is it a peculiar form of posthumous remembrance? I think it's kind of all of the above. There's a foreword in the publishing of this, Mr. Culpeper's Ghost book by the publisher Peter Cole. It basically says, I don't know who did it. I don't want to inquire too deeply in case they get carted off to being a necromancer, which was illegal, which we can come to. But if we have this book and it's said to be from him, isn't it good that we honour him by putting it up? I could not be so forgetful of my old friend and unfaithful to thee, whom I take to be his friend, to let it sleep in oblivion. Ghost stories weren't always so kind. We do also have equivalents of horror movie conventions where apparitions and hauntings of ghosts produce flickering lights, and the early modern equivalent of electrical shortages. There's a pamphlet of 1673 which recounts that a horrid ghost of a woman in a house in Deptford is recorded as being presaged and by the flickering of the candle lights going blue. And this also occurs in, this is obviously a recognisable enough trope in the early modern period that Shakespeare has Richard III notice the lights burn blue just before a procession of ghosts in that play. So this is something that people would recognise. Perhaps the most famous poltergeist case, and also an example of the poltergeist spectacle in this period is the Tedworth drummer. Owen Davies relates this account. This is in 1662-63. The house of a gentleman named John Mompesson, who lived in Tedworth, was plagued by strange noises, smells and lights. Most curious of all, a drum that had been confiscated from a vagrant drummer and petty conjurer named William Jury, who had been arrested for possessing fake documentation, began to emanate beats and even banging out whole tattoos. Jury was an obvious suspect causing the disruption, but for some time, Jury was locked up in Gloucester jail on an unrelated charge. It was a mystery. Could Jury have been extracting revenge by using magical powers? Was it the devil making mischief? A neighbour told Mompson's wife that fairies sometimes paid visits to humans to leave money. Joseph Glanville was told by a curious Somerset physician that it was nothing but a rendezvous of witches, and that for £100 he would undertake to rid the house of all disturbance. The explanations of the different things that are going on when these noises and lights and smells are occurring are typical of the way of many different occult explanations for bizarre phenomena in early modern England. The effects of a troublesome enchantment was an option, but so were the affairs of fairies and or witches, as well as the devil himself. Moreover, the Tedworth case actually becomes this early modern poltergeist spectacle. Word of the bizarre house spread quickly, and rumours attracted investigators from the clergy, gentry, and aristocracy. It's even suggested that Mompesson attempted to, if not put about the rumour, certainly not dismiss the rumour that it was a hoax, so people would stop coming to his house and eating his food and drinking him at house and home. This is the account that we get from his son that he tells a college friend later on, that we let it happen that people thought it was a hoax, but we knew it was true, but we couldn't afford to keep the spectacle running. So what, if clergy were attending these kinds of things, was the church's position on ghosts? Well, the most significant dimension, as I've always alluded to, was that purgatory was obviously a very important part of ghost belief, and therefore linked with Catholicism, vilified through much of the early modern English period. To believe in ghosts was not merely necessarily to be credulous, but to probably be a secret Catholic traitor. Furthermore, in Attack and Purgatory and the possibility of spirits returning to walk the earth, the reach of the devil and the demonic was extended. The Swiss Reformed pastor Ludwig Laffer published his Of Ghosts and Spirits Walking the Night, where he attempted to prove that souls could not return to earth until Judgment Day, at the behest of the Almighty. And any supposedly ghostly appearances that people had experience with were clearly, fakes, tricks of the light, or perhaps significantly, spirits pretending to be the dead, chiefly demons or even the devil himself. But even those otherwise good Protestants who saw ghosts or accepted their existence were affected by this further complication of spirits, the difficulty, as it's been put, of determining whether manifestations were the works of witches, devils, fairies, or ghosts. Thus, most cases reported on ghostly, angelic, or demonic activity merely refer to the agents as spirits, defined by Joseph Glanville merely as an intelligent creature of the invisible world. It might be a fallen or malevolent angel, a devil of various moral persuasions, an inferior demon, or a wicked soul departed. But not all Protestants were so vehemently anti-ghost, with the general uncertainty over their status manifest perhaps most clearly in the unofficial but still widely practiced rites of desecration of the bodies of suicide victims. At least tacitly, many Protestant clergymen acknowledged that these were polluted corpses and required extra efforts to ensure the rest of the spirit, or at least the demonic influence that had moved it to take its own life, did not continue to wreak evil. There is an ambiguous in-betweenness of the living dead, and indeed of the uncertain official church line on such ghosts, of not quite one thing or another, certainly not accepted, but also not completely without recognition. That is especially reflected in the treatment of suicides. Michael MacDonald and Terence Murphy, in their excellent book on early modern suicide, point out that this is, it is liminality that the roots of desecration practiced in medieval and early modern England expressed above all. Suicides have been buried at crossroads rather than the churchyard or by highways, and often they'd have been buried with a stake in their hearts as well. This was again to stop the restless spirit, either of them or of the thing that caused them to end themselves, of continuing. And sometimes these stakes were, these weren't just, your vampire kind of things. These were huge stakes that would have come up out of the ground, and things were hung on them. And these were places, again, the crossroad where someone has been hanged, or where a suicide has been buried, that were important magically. The agency of spirits themselves was sometimes considered to be a factor in suicide. And a very good example of that is the case of Gilbert Wright. included in the description by William Lilly, who's one of the most famous astrologers of the 17th century. Lilly gets into trouble periodically, especially when he predicts accurately the Great Fire of London in 1666 and various other instances. Included in this description of several amulets that were in the possession of his wife and master's widow, Margaret Wright, when she died, was one that had been made to protect his former master, Gilbert Wright, from being haunted by a spirit he believed was tempting him to suicide. Wright had contracted the spirit by staying in a Sussex Inn room in which a previous resident had killed himself. This is what Lilly says about this. After the night's lodging, he was perpetually and for many years followed by a spirit which vocally and articulately provoked him to cut his throat. He, not making anybody acquainted with it, at last grew melancholy and discontented, which being carefully observed by his wife, she desired him to acquaint her with the cause of his distemper, which he then did. Away she went to Dr. Simon Foreman, who, having framed this sigil, the astrological medallion, and hanged it about his neck, he, wearing it continually until he died, was never more molested by the spirit. Now, this short account gives us a couple of really interesting things. The first thing to observe is the ambiguous relation, again, between spirits, demons, and ghosts. It's unclear whether the spirit that haunts Gilbert Wright is the spirit of the person that killed himself in the room where he stayed, or the spirit that caused the last tenant to kill themselves. Secondly, the case also offers clear evidence of the importance of place, of the importance of environmental factors, even when attributing extreme emotional, cognitive, affective disturbances to the interference of these spirits, these non-material intelligences. And so suicidal impulses were in part considered contagious. To hear of someone committing suicide could move one to the kind of melancholy that itself could make suicide contagious. And to combat this, we had anti-anxiety amulets. Just over a fifth of the amulets that the astrologer physician Richard Napier was in contact with the physician that Margaret Wright went to see, Simon Foreman, just over a fifth of the amulets that Napier described were to suicidal patients. And it seems that amulets were a particularly significant component of magical approaches to the suicidal impulses and protection from the spirits associated with them. So, necromancy itself. Necromancy in this period is to begin upon a shady business to analyse in of itself. Part of the difficulties emerge from needing to separate the actual practices from related conceptions and prejudices, both contemporary and being laid on by historians. When attempting to look at and analyse what necromancers actually did, rather than what others were accused of, we need to be aware of the place of the dead themselves. We also need to be aware of how images and reports of necromancers inform the practices of magicians. I find this sort of analogous to how the study of folk magic, cunning craft, and magic itself has to take on, but also separate itself from looking at witch trials and witch hunts rather than witchcraft itself. These kinds of things inform each other. So the first strand to attempt to disentangle this is that of necromancy, or sort of generalised black magic. This is a sort of catch-all byword for evil doings. And this is the famous image of supposedly Edward Kelly raising the spirit in the churchyard. And Sean Lovett, historian of early modern necromancy and literature, says that the threat of black magic pose the ability to transform a churchyard into fertile grounds for profane transgressions becomes an image for contemplation. It is as a representation of necromancy that this image can be aligned with the suspicious practices of others. And this image and accompanying story first appears in by John Weaver in 1631 and names the Kelly's accomplice as a man called Paul. The plot does somewhat thicken from this supposed image of a projection of necromancy as black magic when we read that John Dee's diaries do say that Edward Kelly was interested in contacting quote reprobate spirits, and considering how often that Dee himself was accused of necromancy, this is worth further investigation, sadly, no time this time. The second one is witchcraft. Such notions of witchcraft of black magic, specifically the black magic practiced by the nefarious others, also tie in with broader conceptions of the workings of evil witches. The 17th century physician and magic skeptic Thomas Adey even asked rhetorically, how can this distinction hold that witchcraft differeth from necromancy? As we've seen, lack of solid definition of a spirit as a ghost or a demon exacerbates this connotation of working with the dead, working with evil spirits. There's also a gendered aspect to this as well. One of the historian Craig Rustici has written a book about it's called the Afterlife of Pope Joan. It's about the use of the legend of the female pope, and she's attributed particularly dangerous works of necromantic magic, along with the Enchiridion, Leo III, and various other necromancy popes such as Sylvester II and Alexander VI. So finally, yeah, what about diabolism itself? So the necromancer isn't really working with the dead, but working with the devil. There's this long-standing notion that seeing as only God can bring back the departed, and which would probably only occur at the day of judgment, any apparent ghost summoned was in fact the devil in disguise. And we briefly sort of get this concept being sort of looked at in Christopher Marlowe's Faustus, where chiefly the good doctor is so enamoured by the image of Helen of Troy that his desire obliterates his discernment of truth, whether she's a ghost, an image of her, a simulacrum created, or a devil pretending to be her. And this kind of moralising force is fairly typical and gives, in this particular moral reading of the play, of which there are many, but this particular kind of one is equally valid for magic skeptics or decriers of necromancy, which is that necromancers consort with devils or devilish imaginings, fall in love with their own creations or conjurations, deny God and damn themselves. So, bearing in mind such connotations of the term and practices, let's look at a specific definition of the necromancer. This is from Blount's Glossographia, which is a dictionary of obscure terms, actually. And it's described as one that practices the wicked art, the master of the black art, and that seeks to the dead or consorts with Satan in the shape of a dead man. There's interesting factors where some of the techniques are given as well. One makes oneself hungry and lodges amongst graves, that the dead might come to them in a dream. Might wear certain clothes for that purpose, or certain words, might burn incense. And the difference he gives between necromancers and witches is quoting King James's demonology, that one in a sort command and the other obey the devil. So all this talk of James gives us an in to talk about the legality of necromancy. The most pertinent piece of legislation comes in 1604, the same year that Faustus is published, although it's been performed for at least a decade before. In an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits, which came into effect on the Feast of St. Michael of 1604, the act commanded that if any person practice or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil or wicked spirit to or for any intent or purpose, or take any dead man, woman, or child out of his or her or their grave, or any other part where the dead body rested, or the skin, bone, or any other part of the dead person to be employed or used in any manner of witchcraft, sorcery, charm, or enchantment. So once again, consorting with evil spirits is conflated with necromancy and working with the dead. There were some slightly more sanctioned forms of working with the dead, and the first to sort of, I guess, address is exorcism. Some of the few instances of banned but otherwise Christian practices involve both exorcism and ghost slaying. The 1604 Act, just quoted from, also forbade priests to attempt any pretense whatsoever, either of possession or obsession, by fasting and prayer, to cast out any devil or devils. Exorcism itself is also seen as a little too close to Catholicism, and also a little too close to ritual magic. This case here that's given is a description of an exorcism, and it bears a lot of similarity to the instructions of medieval grimoire magic, and also certainly some ecclesiastical magic. You make a circle, you've got lots of crosses around it, there's a variety of characters, special markings and words. Holy water, holy stone, the Gospel of St. John, which is a very, very popular amulet in this period for all sorts of different things. You take the first part of the bit and rip out the Bible or copy it out. Or wash a Bible with that bit and use the ink in something. The piece of wax that you can get this day. And you can use this to defend yourself against evil spirits. These are all aspects found in the ritual magic of medieval criminals. So although Anglican clergy were unable, both legally and theologically, to exorcise, they were still asked occasionally to lay ghosts, to ease their wandering and potentially violent restlessness. The distinction between laying and exorcism is also laid out in James's demonology. It says there are two means. One is ardent prayer, and the other is the amendment of life from such sins that have brought to you, that have procured that extraordinary plague. So if you are plagued with ghosts or something you think is a ghost, you can either pray or you can change your wicked ways, because obviously the ghosts have come as punishment from God. Despite the wording of the Act of 1604, for many contemporary Puritans, ardent prayer expressly involved fasting. There's also a considerable tradition of resorting to clergymen in the event of ghosts for specific and artificial assistance. And it's this notion of pious and professional scribes and readers and scholars being associated with knowing about ghosts that we see in St. Hamlet. Thou art a scholar, Horatio, speak to it. So these have all been about how other people consider necromancy. So what did actual magicians say about necromancers? Agrippa's 3 books has a chapter on reviving the dead, but it's spoken of in the same way as like magical comas, basically people that have slept for hundreds of years and then awoken, who just needed their souls and or body reviving. And so this is more a case of medicine than it is with working with the dead. Elsewhere, however, in one of his other treatises, Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, Agrippa identifies necromancers as those that invoke the souls of dead bodies, who enchant children and cause them to give answer to oracle. We have the illusion once more of sciomancy and necromancy. Sciomancy is the divination by the shades of the dead, and necromancy by the dead themselves. With scrying, the practice of purifying a child seer seems to have not been uncommon in the early modern period. And also with a certain animistic demonology as well, this notion of keeping pocket demons, which is also very, has a lot of parallels with the idea of familiar spirits and with the things that witches do. Agrippa also breaks down necromancers into those that practice using 2 different means. The one is by the efficacy and power of sacred names, because seeing that every creature doth fear and reverence the name of its creator, no wonder if conjurers and other infidels, pagans, Jews, Saracens, or profane persons, do think to force the devil's obedience by the terror of his creator's name. But Agrippa also says that there are the other sort. He says these are far, far worse, because they actually sacrifice to devils and demons and the devil and worship them, become guilty of the vilest subjection and idolatry that may be. For the devils are always watchful to entrap men in the errors they so heedlessly run into. Agrippa even, kindly enough, gives us a whole list of some attributed authors of necromantic texts. And there's some really interesting ones there. They're not just, Adam, the first man who speaks the first language. They're also, we get St. Cyprian in there, we get Albertus Magnus, we get Thomas Aquinas, we get St. Jerome, and we even get angels. So once more we encounter idolatry and worship of the devil, and also powerful books delivered by mysterious spirits, by demons pretending to be spectres, and witchcraft and necromancy considered as, if not the same thing, certainly deviant bedfellows. We get this as well with the reflection of Goetia and gender. Agrippa summarises the contemporary conceptions underlying this gendering of necromancy. It says that because women are more covetous of the knowledge of secrets, and not less cautious and prone to superstition, and more easily deluded, therefore to them the devil show themselves more familiar, and make them the performers of many miracles, as are related to Kirky and Medea, and many other stories that the poets are full. And we have this sense again of, he mentions the witch of Endor, who's supposed to raise the spirit of Samuel, and this notion that it can't have actually been Samuel, it was the devil who was in it. So, what about actual necromantic rituals? In the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, there are several necromantic rituals, or experiments of the dead. The first, to have the spirit of the dead body. In short, you make a circle, you go to the grave, make a circle, and begin with a conjuration to Asariel, Ariel, or Asakiel, who is listed as the king of the dead, or the keeper of the bones of the dead, and you ask him for the spirit of this whose body lies here for the present, to be bound to you and to pay you obedience. A necromantic conjuration to this period typically offered, typically employed both carrot and stick, for both promises and threats. The threats are very typical of this kind of ritual magic that you be damned by all God's holy names and all his angels and saints and so on. But there was a certain level of promise as well. Beyond conjuring using various holy names, the necromancer promises the spirit that I will cause to be celebrated 5 masses on the holy feast of Blessed Mary the Virgin, for forgiveness and pardon of thy soul from year to year while I live. And I guess this is the point of working with the spirit to elevate them. And again, we have underlying notions of purgatory, that the spirit is doing something that it doesn't want to be there, and it helps in some way. That particular experiment in the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet doesn't have specific purposes. As you summon the spirit, get it to be obedient to you and then get it to do something. But it gives an example of the kind of thing you might do with it. And he gives likely reason as getting the spirit to presently make haste and forthwith bring a book of magic, science and art written in such a hand and with such letters that I may read it well and in such a tongue that I may well understand it. This is something we'll return to, books and spirits. The notion of a ruler of the dead that we get from Asariel or Azazel, to which the necromancer must first appeal, is also found in another magic book of this period, one of Humphrey Gilbert, who is the half-brother of Sir Walter Raleigh. And there's several factors of similarity between Gilbert's book, which is it's 2 halves. It's a grimoire of how to do the stuff, and it's the visions recorded doing it that is dated to around the spring of 1567, and Gauntlet's, which is dated to mid to late 17th century. And it's this important of the spirit Asasa, which is also expressly identified in both Gauntlet and Gilbert as the keeper of the bones of the dead. As Phil Legard has pointed out in his examination of Gilbert's grimoire, this spirit is obviously ultimately derivative of the Jewish Azazel. But more pertinently to our current endeavour, Gilbert's purpose for summoning or petitioning Azazel was no less than seeking assistance in conjuring the, quote, best spirits of a dead man that ever was in the world to teach me all manner of arts appertaining to learning and hidden knowledge, that is, with expressly necromantic intentions. He's summoning dead magicians, and we've got some accounts of the kind of dead magicians he spoke to and the advice he got from them in the scrying section. Another common feature of these 2 forms of necromancy is the charge to a spirit to bring forth a magical book. In the case of Gilbert's grimoire, this charge is levelled at the spirit Oriens, who, along with his fellow demonic kings of the directions, also plays an important role in Gilbert's work. This is not any old magical text. Gilbert instructs the operator to command Oriens to give the best book that ever was. Beyond the implications of this office of Oriens, the book should also be understood not only, or not merely, as a means to magical knowledge, but as a directly talismanic power object in its own right. To briefly sort of paraphrase Phil Legard's analysis of this, there's a rich tradition in ritual magic of the book as a symbol of power over the spirits, the Liber Spiritorum, this is exactly what we're getting in the case of Gilbert. A very means, a very instrument of doing. As mentioned, Gilbert also utilised more direct necromantic methods to access magical knowledge and power. That is, by conversing with the shades of famous dead magicians, of which we have the case notes. So him and his seer, John Davis, asked various angelic, biblical and occult authorities on the best way to efficaciously comport themselves when they're doing their necromancy. And yeah, they're told to go, these instructions aren't terribly unusual in traditions. They go in clean apparel, they're good to the poor. This is a very important aspect of Christian life. Time to give alms. You can go in a black cloak, and to tell none that thou sawest. And again, this idea of secrecy becomes very important. This notion of taking magical practice pointers from spirits or receiving a talismanic text are means of empowering one's practice by collaborative consultation with, as well as directed conjuration of the dead. It's a fascinating example of the range and depth of early modern English necromantic activity. There's one other account of another experiment of the dead in Gauntlets I'm going to rush through. It's a conjuration taken directly from Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. There's again this idea that a book that's set out to show you all the bad things that evil people do is being bought by people to do those things, not merely to exercise the panic or the media scare of the thing. And what's interesting about this one is that you conjure the dead spirit to try and go and fetch you the Queen of the Fairies, Stilia. And so we have this interesting interrelation of fairy lore with the dead and with necromancy. It's also interesting that this experiment we're meant to go to the grave of one that has killed themselves willfully. And so again, the notion of the liminal and powerful nature of the ghost of suicide. You can even, in Scott's account, you can even go to a condemned person and ask them to swear obedience to you, and that in return, once they're executed, you'll get them to do stuff. They will be your ghost body, effectively. But you will also make prayers and assure the eventual elevation of their soul. Again, Scott notes, let no person see thy doing, or you can do nothing to any purpose. Secrecy, as advised by the shades of Agrippa et al., is not merely a form of self-preservation when attempting to practice illicit or illegal magic, but it's actually a necessity for its efficacious work. So, what nation conclusions can we draw from this kind of sketchy adumbration of early modern necromancy and the place of the dead in early modern English magic? Well, firstly, there are clear interconnections of necromancy with scrying. When you go, several of Gauntlets experiments list that when you go, you should bring a crystal or a large stone in which the spirit will appear. The examples of using the child seer as well, and several other examples give you this thing that we're looking at scrying. We're also looking at bits of all sorts of different conjunctions of grimoire magic, of spell books themselves, of systems of magic, of a liber spiritorum or a testament that you use to command spirits themselves as a talismanic object. Also in connection with fairies, with dream, and with secrecy. To think in wider environmental contexts, the connection between the dead and agriculture is also worthy of some comment. Stephen Wilson notes that the fact that the dead could harm crops was only one example of the many ways in which the dead were associated with the well-being and prosperity of the community, and more particularly with fertility. And again, we have this notion that wakes featured obscene jokes, that the greenery carried was the mixture of margarine, which would have been used for joy, because Forestans is the joy of the mountain, as well as rosemary for remembrance. These flowers were placed on graves and in graves. Tombstones were related to depict vines and cereals. And the spirits of the dead, moreover, were thought of as entering the plants and trees. And death was personified as a figure carrying a scythe. He was a grim reaper in agricultural work. And these connections between the dead and crops, between the lifeblood and fertile soil, between the rulership of the underworld and what emerges from the earth, are of course particularly ancient. Finally, there are early modern attitudes and practices that relate working with the dead with forms and means of producing texts, of receiving or generating writings generally and specifically, as well as simply knowledge as a general category. These texts could themselves be powerful magical talismanic objects in their own right, and this kind of thing certainly I think requires further study and analysis. I'd like to see other people do it. For now though, I'd also like to humbly suggest in closing that the practice of history itself can be considered a form of divination by the dead, of operative knowledge drawn from the numerous graves, powerful books, battlefields turned poppy fields, and deserted ruins, the very foundations of our cities. you know, after all, the role of the historian, right, is at odds with a lot of people. A lot of people want to speak for the dead, you know, whether that's you know, entrenched elites talking about tradition and the way things have always been in order to, you know, justify their oppression, or dogmatic radicals, you know, cherry picking their precedents and favouring an ideology over the people that the ideology doesn't care who dies for. And in this sense, the you know, history, responsible history, I hope, is about letting the dead speak for themselves. That's why I've been quoting so much at you. And I guess you could say that, you know, this responsible necromancy of history is about the you know, the only silent majority of that, which I give a damn, but that would be to deny that, you know, the dead are speaking to us all the time. You know, they're arguing and laughing and screaming, spectral though those voices might be. And so, yeah, on this All Souls Day, I'd like to dedicate these words to the dead, you know, to the remembered and to the forgotten, to the resting and to the angry. Thank you very much for having me. Good day.